Hey everyone, I'm today's discussant, and we're just going to go over the two articles on transnational advocacy networks is the first one, and then the second's on the climate crisis, and different ways we mobilize on different transnational causes. So the first is going to be about the advocacy networks. Um, there's a ton of content in this article. It's not very long, but there's a lot packed in, so I'm going to try to go kind of more broad. Already recorded this one, so it's 15 minutes. We're going to cut it down a bit. Um, so the authors in this, in their introduction, just basically lay out what's going to happen in the rest of the article. So they talk about what are transnational advocacy networks, how do they work, where are they most successful, what are different strategies they use, things like that. So generally speaking, they are organizations built up of lots of different groups that kind of appeal to larger audiences, and they stand in for people in different social issues, and they frame larger ideas for better audiences that are smaller, more engaged, and they really help gain media attention for all of these causes, and they're well known because they turn these global issues into fightable causes. So that gets us to the first question that they propose in their article, which is what are transnational advocacy networks? So just kind of talked about that, but to add a little bit more, they are groups, they can be NGOs, that's what a lot of them are, built up of NGOs, but they can also be branches of government, they can be foundations, churches, anything. They're typically global causes, hence transnational. And then Walter Powell, they cited him, he's a sociologist, cited them as kind of a third mode of economic organization. So the currency in that economic organization is the trade of knowledge and information. And a lot of these networks work by exchanging information, using it to their advantage to help these causes. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And they are just kind of these groups of volunteers typically who try to communicate and make change. So that's what they're on a broader scale. How and why do they emerge? So the authors say that they emerge in kind of a pattern. So obviously funding a global and governmental issue is very expensive for a variety of reasons that they list. Some of them are on here. And because of that, people who are fighting against their government for some sort of reason might need help. So they tend to link up with NGOs or different organizations, a lot of transnational advocacy networks, and those networks send activists into areas in what's called a boomerang pattern. And those activists then are able to kind of go out and help. And then they circle back around to NGOs and all the way back to the advocacy networks for support and gaining traction. So it's called a boomerang. It's kind of in this cycle of needing activists and making change. They typically start because people who are political entrepreneurs believe they can make a difference. So this is just kind of someone who has the will and the means, and they want to step out in the world and do something. And then with that information and power, they make spaces for strengthening the networks through things like summits, different events, protests, things like that. The second question is, how do they work? And in this section, we're introduced to a couple different important terms. The first is frame alignment. And this is when we render different events as meaningful in different frames to guide different actions. So one example of this is in the fight for the Amazon rainforest. They were having a good amount of support, but not as much as they could in the fight for the indigenous people that live there. And they actually gained a lot more support when they shifted to a deforestation cause. So that's just kind of one way that they were still fighting the same issue, but changed the framing, and so that it appealed to more people who were able to help. Frame resonance is the relationship between an organization's work and their ability to influence the broader public. So kind of how they place themselves in an issue, or if they think they can't work on certain issues because of the way that their organization works, that's frame resonance. And then they talk about tarot in this chapter a little bit, and just how this way that these organizations place themselves in battles and government issues can help build a collective action or a personality for the movement. And whatever advocacy network that is part of that movement will actually help create personality and kind of give it a label that people are maybe more able to recognize. There's four main political tactics they use here. So the first is information politics, which is using facts and testimonies to kind of tell the story, get more attention. Testimonies are great because they kind of help involve ordinary people and make you feel something a little bit more than just a statistic. Symbolic politics is using a singular event to demonstrate a whole cause. So one example of this is back in the International Year of the World's Indigenous People, the winner of one of the Nobel Peace Prizes was Rigoberta Menchú, who was an Indigenous person. So this kind of served as a symbol of success for Indigenous people. Leverage politics is just leveraging things. Material goods is one example, so like money, aid packages, military support for needing to see action or political change. And the moral leverage is just how it sounds, guilting someone into doing something they don't want to do for the sake of maybe votes or public perception. And then accountability politics is a little bit tricky, but seems to work in some situations. And that's where governments will make statements that are kind of just used to put the public at ease, but these networks hold them accountable for the statements they make to gain support. The next question is, under what conditions do they have influence? So they tend to gain influence in a pattern of having an issue, kind of finding out where they're placed in an issue and starting working on it, and then slowly building state support. And that starts as behavioral change and changing of maybe a norm publicly that can then transfer into legislative change and then change in state action, because you can have a legislative change, but if the state doesn't enforce it, it doesn't do much. And then they tend to be most successful in two main networks. So the first is those involving bodily harm to the innocent. This can be super debatable because you have to define who's innocent and what is bodily harm. So that's why, like, it's a little bit easier to gain support for people who are tortured as war and political prisoners versus not allowing the death penalty for criminals because people don't interpret them as innocent. And then the second is issues involving equality of opportunity. This does not mean equality of outcome, but the opportunity to try. So that is where they're most successful. And then the final thoughts here are that these networks work because of the world polity theory. So globally, people tend to follow similar trends and have similar ideas. This is why we see patterns in education around the world. People tend to respect human rights and citizenship. So these networks can kind of work with these concepts. And then to kind of wrap up everything they said, these transnational advocacy groups are global groups that support the voiceless and use different political tactics to influence behavioral change. So yeah, here's the discussion questions for that reading. I'm going to end this video and you guys can look at these, but there's another video for the second article. Thank you.